Following on from last week, you should have a reasonable grasp by now of the background to the epic poem, the Cantar de Mio Cid. We will go on to talk a little bit more about that this week and in seminar as well. You should have a reasonable idea of working definition, perhaps, of epic, and we will talk again about icons and myths shortly. What I want to do today then is to cover a number of elements specifically related to the epic poem, but also moving on from that to think about how this particular icon, and perhaps this particular myth, is seen and reseen and recreated, and the layering process for the acquisition of meaning of the icon, to see how that works over time. Just by way of recap, then, just to say to you that the Cantar de Mio Cid is formally split up into three separate cantares. So there's three um, formal, two formal divisions, therefore, and three cantares. There's two main storylines, as you probably will know by now. There's the storyline of El Cid destitute at the beginning, having been expelled by King Alfonso VI for we know not what exactly, and the military prowess, his military prowess, brings him back to a degree of honor to the point that he is able, with his own band of warriors, to capture Valencia. The second storyline, which, unlike the first, is almost certainly not historically based, covers the return to honor, I suppose, and the return to acceptance by King Alfonso, and is associated with the Cid's two daughters. We will talk a little bit more about that perhaps in seminars. There's a cast of thousands, there's many people involved, many recurring characters. The themes, therefore, is that of fall and redemption. It is full of symbolism, different types of symbolism, including beards, horses, the whole question of masculinity and the nature of that masculinity. Is it fragile at the beginning, perhaps, and returned to its previous glory by the end? All of these things, in fact, you can see in the statues, so that particular form of iconography has remained. We'll also be thinking about Mio Cid as the historical figure, that particular person who existed, as we know, at the end of the 11th century, who is not the same as the epic hero, who is not the same as the subject of history, not the same as the icon. The way those four things relate to each other, they are all, of course, summed up in the name Mio Cid or El Cid, or Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar, all the same character, but what that character might mean, what that hero might mean, what that icon might mean, is very much dependent on the context. So before we talk in any great detail about the cantar itself, about the epic poem itself, I'd just like briefly to return to Antonio's discussion, to Antonio's definitions of iconicity. So we started with some very broad ones, some very bold ones. The Oxford English Dictionary, a person or thing regarded as a representative symbol, especially of a culture or movement. And in the second one, the artifact identified by members of a culture as representative of that culture. And of course, it's a very basic outline. So what I would like you to do perhaps is to think in what you have seen in El Cid, to what extent is he an icon in this sense. We will see shortly again, as you did with Antonio, a rather more nuanced account of what iconicity might be. But we will discuss in seminar right from the very beginning the extent to which El Cid is an icon in any or all of these terms. So I would like you perhaps to spend some time thinking about that. I'm not really going to talk about representativity in the nature of iconicity, just to say that truly iconic images accrue legends to a prodigious degree that is largely independent of how long they've been around. An extraordinary image demands an extraordinary explanation. Well, if you think about El Cid, the figure has been around for over 800 years, in fact, over 900 years. So we might have a particular historical view of the nature of pre-modern iconicity. And you might then want to compare and contrast that with what you have seen with the other iconic figures. And perhaps particularly in this case, I'm thinking of uh, Che Guevara. If you look at the next one of Antonio's definitions, we had distinctness of image, durability of image, reproducibility of image, tragic dramatic narrative inherent in the image. Of course, we are dealing with image in the case of El Cid in a very different way, although perhaps the image in this case is the statue, which has been the recurring theme, the wallpaper for all of my discussions so far. Uh, to what extent, I would like you to ask yourself, do these elements apply to El Cid? And in the case that they do, um, does that change our notion of what iconicity is? Since iconicity, as we have been thinking about it, is very much attached to the modern. Whereas, well, cultural icons are always images, distinct, durable, and reproducible. Is El Cid therefore not a cultural icon? El Cid, in the past, of course, was a human individual. Images in what sense, one might ask, because El Cid has naturally come to us primarily through words and memories, collective memory, as it says there, but a large group of people, tragic, dramatic narratives that are formed and received by communities. These things are also true of El Cid. Is it possible then that El Cid is the classic icon? That although it is not an image in the same sense as we think of the image of Evita or of Che Guevara or even of the city of Barcelona, um, the advantage, as it says in this definition, is that it links cultural icons to areas of natural cultural inquiry, such as collective memory, and of course El Cid, and indeed national identity. El Cid comes from a time where collective memory was perhaps the most important preserver of cultural cultural memory, culture or culture generally. It comes from a time before the notion of the national at all. So perhaps there's something about the nature of El Cid as icon that is even more central to iconicity than the others that you have seen. I'm not going to talk about any of these to any great degree, just that I would like you, perhaps while I'm talking over them, to think about these definitions again that you had at the very start of the course and to ask yourself the extent to which they could apply to something early modern, to an early, sorry, not early modern, to pre-modern, to a medieval cultural phenomenon, which is not based in the image in the same sense that we think of Cordo's image of Che Guevara, but is a different type of cultural memory. Now, icono, icon, of course, these things have come to mean something in the modern sense, which they did not have previously. And we always run the risk when speaking about the past of presentism, if you like. That is to say, we take the terms of the present and use them as a way of understanding the past. Icon, in the sense in which we are talking about it, would not have meant anything to Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, and yet we are using that term to speak about him in that way. You always have to bear in mind then that the words that we use, the terms that we use to talk about something necessarily condition the understanding that we might have of it. Just bear in mind then that any of these definitions are valid as analytical tools, but they don't necessarily reflect the life as it was, so to speak. Well, we come back then to these questions. These were the questions which you were asked about the first set of icons, and you might have applied to Barcelona also by now. Does the term have any meaning at all? Can it be applied to something? Is fundamentally the question that I'm asking you. Can cultural icons be appropriated by a specific culture, appropriated or created by a specific culture? But the second last bullet point is also very important. What culture are we talking about? After all, the 21st century Spain is not Franco's Spain, and much less 11th century Castile. So, is there a line running through all of the cultures which are encompassed by the places and times I have just mentioned? Are these things all the same? These are general questions which one must ask before even approaching a particular icon. I'll leave you with this then for the moment, that I'm particularly interested in the first bullet point, the essential conditions of iconicity that need to be present for the visual sign, but ours is not visual, to attain cultural iconic status. Accreting layers of meaning or connotation. I think we have seen, and you will go on to see, that the El Cid is a classic example of this, of how different layers of meaning, different contexts, and different contexts interact with each other. Meaning, therefore, is not just derived from context, but it also influences context and therefore creates another set of meaning. And you might want to ask yourself how that works, and if the creation of El Cid as cultural icon is different, is in its accretion of layers of meaning or connotation. If it is different in its continuity over 900 years to the way in which the icons that are particularly, I suppose, Che Guevara or Evita have attained, or the continuity that they have attained over the last 50 years, and if that is therefore the same kind of phenomenon. I won't talk about this again in any great detail, this is by way of reminder of the things that Antonio mentioned to you. Constructedness, I think, is something very important, and I would like you to ask yourself about the constructedness of this icon that we are dealing with here, and how is that different, or is it the same as the constructedness of the icons we have seen so far? And the final thing to say about the Antonio's Guide to Iconicity is, well, you may not have picked up on this at the time, but when he gave you the example of Madonna, appropriating the statue of the Madonna, the object of Christian medieval painting. So even so modern or postmodern an icon as Madonna has connections, and of course even in her name, although that is her name, even in the name itself, the accretion of layers and golden thread of meaning leads us back in one way to the medieval period. So icons, we speak of icons and cultural icons as a modern phenomenon, and yet they all have, to some extent or another, some historical value previous to